Today's lesson is about women in the Progressive Era. Our essential question, how did women contribute to the Progressive Era and what major victories did they have? First, let's start off with what conditions were like for women in the early 1900s. Just like most Americans who worked in factories, women also faced difficult working conditions. But on top of that, often women were required to hand over their wages to fathers or husbands or brothers, whatever man was in their life who was basically in control of their finances. So they didn't even have like the independence to enjoy the little bit of money they made. Women were treated as second class citizens. It was typical that women were expected to follow the rule, don't speak unless you're spoken to. Usually that's told to children nowadays, but that also applied to women. And probably most important of all, women had no right to vote. Um, we've discussed why it's important to be able to vote. It's how you have a say in the government. And that was denied to about 50% of the United States population. So we know that the Progressive Era was about the progressive movement. Women were leaders within the movement. They worked as muckrakers. We talked about Ida Tarbell yesterday. She certainly wasn't the only female muckraker. They were leaders in the temperance movement to limit the use of alcohol. They worked in settlement houses like Jane Addams' Hull House. And they were leaders against unfair working conditions. One woman in particular, Florence Kelley, helped establish the National Consumers League and the Women's Trade Union League. The National Consumers League, they put like a little stamp on food that we can see over here that showed consumers that not only what they were consuming was safe and had been investigated and checked out, but also that they were made in safe and healthful conditions. The Women's Trade Union League was a leader within the movement to get better working conditions. We can see from this over here that they fought for an 8-hour working day, a living wage. So women were leaders in all types of movements during this time, which led to them demanding more say in their government. One female leader was Margaret Sanger. We see her over here. She opened the country's first birth control clinic and founded the American Birth Control League. Her actions regarding birth control, handing out pamphlets, educating women on birth control, eventually landed her in jail. Birth control was a highly controversial topic during this time and illegal in many places to distribute information about it. But Margaret Sanger had a very personal stake in this. She came from a family with lots of children. Her mother actually died due to complications with childbirth, and she believed that less kids would lead to a better family life. It wasn't only beneficial for the women who were giving birth, but also the children and the fathers. Also during this time, complications due to childbirth was a leading killer of women. Often women gave birth so many times that their bodies eventually gave out. So this was more than just a lifestyle change to lead to a better lifestyle, but it was also a health issue. I told you the other day that we would talk about our other Ida. Here she is, Ida B. Wells. Ida was a black teacher that helped found the National Association of Colored Women. She used this organization to fight for women's suffrage because unfortunately during this time, most of the mainstream suffrage organizations wouldn't allow African American women to join their ranks. They felt that it would hurt their cause. So she was a leader of women's suffrage specifically for black women, as well as spoke out against lynching and Jim Crow laws. We'll talk more about Ida B. Wells later. So before we move into the suffrage movement, let's have a quick review. Hopefully you remember all of these things from AH1. Suffrage, we know, means the right to vote. The first Women's Rights Convention. I hope you remember that that was Seneca Falls in the 1840s. And the document that was drafted there was the Declaration of Sentiments. This was a document that was based on the Declaration of Independence. And the important phrase that the women at this conference tweaked was, instead of all men are created equal, all men and women are created equal. The early suffrage leaders, the two women who planned the Seneca Falls Convention, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott, as well as Susan B. Anthony. Many other leaders among that group as well. And which amendment gave African American males the right to vote but still denied it specifically for women? And that was the 15th. And that was a huge deal after the Civil War because women had been fighting for the right to vote for decades. But instead of proposing an amendment that just allowed everyone to vote, women were still specifically denied this right. So the lady we see here is Carrie Chapman Catt. She was a new leader of the suffrage movement, kind of taking up the baton because many of the early suffrage leaders had grown old or even had passed on by this point. She was the president of NAWSA, a suffrage organization. NAWSA stands for the National American Woman Suffrage Association, which is kind of long and redundant, but it was the merger of two separate groups that had previously been split on the best way to obtain the right to vote. So it was a combination of the National Woman Suffrage Association and the American Woman Suffrage Association. So Carrie Chapman Catt is remembered for her winning plan. Under her leadership, NAWSA fought for suffrage on two fronts. First of all, at the state level, they used the referendum power to gain the right to vote in the states, put that on the ballots in individual states, as well as still petitioning for a constitutional amendment at the federal level. And this winning plan is going to be very successful, obviously, the winning plan. And it does lead to both state rights to vote and then eventually a constitutional amendment, which we'll talk about. Here's a map that shows voting rights for women prior to 1920. Which region was the most progressive on this issue? Mostly the West. So we see that all of these blue states had full voting rights for women before the 19th Amendment was passed. These gray areas had full voting rights before they even became states, when they were still territories. Green areas, you could vote for president before the 19th Amendment, but not all elections. And then in the southern states, the orange, and then a few of these New England ones, women did not have the right to vote in any election until the 19th Amendment was added to the Constitution. So another suffrage leader that we talk about is Alice Paul. She was the leader of the more radical sect of suffragists. She promoted more radical tactics such as marches, protests. Whenever these women were arrested for their protests, they would perform hunger strikes in the jails. And she formed the National Woman's Party to also help fight for the vote. So you have NAWSA that's going the more traditional route, that are seen as more ladylike. And then you have these radical suffragists who are looked down upon by women like Carrie Chapman Catt because they were seen as damaging to the cause. However, their more radical tactics did draw a lot of attention to the suffrage movement. We'll see some pictures on these next couple of slides. Oh, by the way, this is a video, an excerpt from a movie. I'll post that as well, that shows the hunger strike in one of the jails after Alice Paul was arrested. But here's a march through the nation's capital. You see their picket signs. Members of the National Women's Party would often chain themselves to the White House fence in protest. That was one of the things that got them arrested. We see here the sign, Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty? The president at this time was Woodrow Wilson, and they often called out his hypocrisy, as we'll see in the next slide. Not this slide, just kidding. So here we see women holding a banner in front of the White House. And the quote is from President Wilson's war message whenever he said that the United States would declare war on Germany and enter World War I. And he said that the reason why the United States was going to fight over in Europe was that we shall fight for the things which we have always carried nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their government. I hope that we can all recognize the irony here that 50% of the population, women, did submit to authority in the United States, but yet had no voice in their government. That right was denied to them. So the fight for suffrage for women comes to a close in 1920. The year prior to that, 1919, Congress approved an amendment to allow women to vote, but we know that the constitutional amendment process is a very long one. Congress approved the amendment, but then the people had to ratify it through state conventions, and that ratification process is completed in 1920. So the 19th Amendment is added to the Constitution, which says the right to vote shall not be denied or abridged on account of sex. So from here on out, women have the constitutional right to vote. Most of us are aware of things like the literacy test and poll taxes that had previously disenfranchised African American men. Yes, those are also going to be applied to African American women. Also during this time, Native Americans were not considered citizens, so they often did not have the right to vote either. So this really was a victory mainly for white women, but it did set the constitutional precedent that would allow one day all of us to exercise our rights to vote. So why did women finally gain their right to vote? Historians point to a variety of reasons. It is a combination of all of these women who were fighting for the cause, as well as their contributions to the war effort during World War I. Just like in previous wars, women stepped up in the factories, they kept the nation running at home while men were away fighting the war. So after they stepped up during this time, it was kind of like, hey, women do deserve the right to vote. They are people too. They should have a say in their government. Also, Catt's winning plan, petitioning both the states and the federal government, eventually led to the 19th Amendment, as well as the radical efforts by the National Woman's Party, which drew attention to the cause.